Now, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is Deborah Lee-Talbot, also in green. Deborah is a historian fascinated by issues of materiality, religion, gender and archives, and is working on a PhD thesis, tentatively titled Kaleidoscopic Archives, which I love, given the colour theme, finding feminist histories in the Pacific records of the Australian Joint Copying Project, which was the world's most extensive collaborative copying project. Yes. And Deborah's looking at the role of women in the copying project in her paper today, The Historian and the Archivist.
Yes, which has disappeared from the slide. So
now, if you hit that one, it will do the thing. Thanks.
This is going to be fun. I think my days in waitressing are about to come in handy. There we go. All right.
You need a chair to put your thing on.
That's all right. This is why I like going to the libraries. They help with the book muscles, you know. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal peoples, who are the traditional custodians of the land here in Canberra. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and I'd also like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, on whose land I lived and worked while I created this. So welcome everybody. Thank you very much for the very warm welcome and introduction. I am so excited to share this research with you today. I am very enthusiastic about post-war surrogate archival collections, and I feel that you are exactly the audience that I've been looking for. So in February and March this year, I was lucky enough to receive a summer scholarship at the National Library of Australia, and this supported my research into the Australian Joint Copying Project, or the AJCP. This project surveyed and filmed material from European archives, libraries and private collections onto microfilm for the benefit of Australasian researchers from 1939 to 1997. So being the AJCP officers were very good at preserving their communications, I was able to analyse administrative records, policy documents and memos concerning the processes related to the AJCP. But due to time and finances, I had to limit my response to 1939 to 1970. So today I will outline how the librarian and archivist Phyllis Mander-Jones and the historian Marjorie Jacobs worked within official and unofficial roles in relation to these archives to ensure that imperial archives were copied and transferred to Australian research institutions. I will show that collaborative relationships between historians, archivists and librarians supported the significant growth of Australian archival collections, which has in turn supported the growth of Australian Pacific history, which I am particularly attached to. Now, this paper is founded on 3 research experiences. The first is my analysis of the former colonial administrator and Pacific historian Harry Maud's 1967 report, The Documentary Basis for Pacific Studies. Along with the historian Jim Davidson at ANU during the 1950s and 70s, Maud was determined to find and curate Pacific historical records for a new generation of Australian historians. Now, Maud is best known for being part of the Pacific Manuscripts Bureau, which is unfortunately outside of the scope of my talk today. But he was also involved with the surveying and supporting the acquisition of Pacific records for the AJCP. In both projects, Maud recognised the importance of fieldwork to Pacific studies, but his report asserted that Pacific historians relied heavily on documentary evidence by literate travellers to reveal encounters with non-literate islanders. The historians that were emerging in the post-World War II period did so into a region that was shifting away from imperial governance and towards independence, so they wanted those records. The second work underpinning the line of research is Anne-Laura Stoller's book, Along the Archival Grain. Stoller acknowledged that archives have a history of their own, and in doing so, she created room for historians to look into an archive's past. She also alluded to the notion that historians could curate archives, not just walk in and extract information. Third is my encounter, part of which that was my view at the State Library of Victoria, when I encountered the London Missionary Society microfilmed records by the AJCP. Now, examining Pacific records in an Australian library is a unique experience. I was in a colonial era building but I was reading an archive that I knew the originals were held in London, and I was reading documents about the Pacific. So there was a bit of disjuncture about the experience. It stokes my curiosity about how settler societies gain access to imperial records, and are they adapted in any way to ensure access is granted to researchers. Overall, I wanted to understand how and why an Australian library had such a significant archival collection about the Pacific. So the NLA administrative and policy documents showed surrogate archives like the AJCP were an important aspect of creating new national visions in the post-war Australasian region. In the late 1930s, Australian public libraries held significant Pacific and Australiana collections, but after the Second World War and the events of the Pacific between Japan and the Allies especially, they realised that this wasn't enough. So Australian public libraries looked to improve their manuscript holdings regarding European explorations of Australasia. Now, I am very aware that Australasia is a political concept, and you can hear this in its definition. It encapsulates the Australian mainland, New Zealand, Tasmania, Fiji, any other British colonies or possessions, as they put it then, Papua, Solomon Islands, Cook Islands, and Tonga. So the issue was, as a settler society and a heavily colonised space, many manuscripts, maps, diaries, letters, paintings, all those things that give us life, relative to Australian history, were situated in the Imperial Archives of Europe. And the Second World War has exposed Australia's ignorance concerning this region, and moving forward in the post-war period meant the Australian government actually wanted to take the time to correct this intellectual oversight. The staff of the Australian National Library and the New South Wales State Library, in an effort to keep financial costs to a minimum and to ensure that these records would be available to multiple generations, decided that a technology refined during World War II, microfilm, would be best for this copying project. To ensure the project stayed on track, it was guided by an Australian representative. They were very definite they did not want British archivists involved in this project. The libraries appointed a dedicated AJCP staff member in Europe, and the first AJCP officer, C.A. Burmester, was sent to London in 1944. Now, he was the one that set the precedent for the role for the London-based officer, to locate and survey content for copying, to act as a liaison between archivists and librarians in London and Canberra, while also engaging with visiting Australian researchers in London. And this work ran parallel to a survey at the Public Record Office in London to film any government, naval and scientific records relating to Australasia from 1788 to 1860. So it was a social scholarly role. And as he performed these tasks, Burmester asserted that in the aftermath of World War II, Australia was in a unique position compared to Europe, being somewhat of a haven for archival material. Surveying British archives, a number of Australasian texts, how there became apparent, and he pushed for the expansions of what it meant to copy for Australia. He argued that the danger of delay risked the loss of Australian records should another war take place. Only the making and distribution of unique copies would be the right course of action. So the Commonwealth and the state libraries agreed there would be much to gain from liaising with the British institutions and copying their records. Then he made another suggestion that the Commonwealth Library should actively collaborate relationships to support any other dominions that would wish to undertake copying records for their own history. So his suggestion set the foundations for the Australian Joint Copying Project as the world's most extensive copying project. And financial support for the development of this long-term project, not 500 years unfortunately, but it was a start, to support the new intellectual movement in post-war came from the Chifley government. They were also very vocally supported by Pacific historians at the ANU, and they wanted the former empire records or receding empire records as they looked at it. Traders, whalers, administrators and missionaries were incredibly prolific, and I thank them for that. But these historians were also interested in moments of encounter with non-literate people. So they needed the colonial records to illuminate that information. So you guys should know this photo well and truly by now. When I examined the AJCP administrative files, I saw evidence that archivists and historians collaborated, and these relationships influenced the AJCP acquisitions. So I'm going to give a brief overview of Mander-Jones. I'm really sorry. I'm sure you guys know her well. But she was born in 1896, just prior to Federation, when Australia took over Papua from Britain as its first territory. So her formational years were actually backgrounded by conversations about Australia's role in the Pacific and narratives of empire. She became officially involved with the AJCP's when she was Mitchell Librarian in 1946 until 1957. And it was in this role that she argued her support for a project like the AJCP, as discovery and copying of manuscripts onto microfilm would improve researchers' access so they could analyse Australia's past and consider Australia's relationships to the wider Pacific for the future. So in early 1951, Mander-Jones explained to attendees at the Royal Historical Australian Society that constructing Australian archives required material from other nations, and records would be found in Spain, Portugal, France, Holland, England, and their dependencies. The type of information required was a diverse range of texts: imperial administrative documents, exploration field journals, missionary letters, notes, and maps. Aware of the magnitude of what she was proposing, she told her audience, "We're at the beginning of a long road if we're to be adequately equipped to know our own history." The British Empire was constructed as an intricate web of relations, as demonstrated by the New Zealand historian Tony Ballantyne. As such, Mander-Jones needed to gain historic knowledge of this network to ensure crucial Australasian archives could be located and then copied. By 1960, she was the officially appointed AJCP officer in London, and there she drew on her professional experience as Mitchell Librarian. She brought a collaborative approach to this nationalistic copying project. A memo from the principal librarian, Harold White, held at the NLA, dated the 10th of November 1960, was titled "Miss Mander-Jones's Responsibility." I tell you what, I did make a noise when I found that in the archive. White wrote that Mander-Jones was to make a number of surveys of records, not yet microfilmed, to indicate the quality and, as it is so far possible, such practical and other considerations as affect the order in copying program. It is a document that indicates that Mander-Jones had the potential to adapt the AJCP collections as she saw fit. She did this in relation to engagements with researchers most commonly. Her staff were instructed to locate letters of interest from a policy, scientific, or historical point of view, and such content was to be filmed unless obvious duplicates or copies of originals existed in Australian libraries. So a significant issue was highlighted being knowing where to look for records. Mander-Jones ensured that she corresponded with up-and-coming historians about records that they would find beneficial. Pacific historian Dorothy Scheinberg in the 1960s collaborated with Mander-Jones about material acquisitions. In 1965, Scheinberg contacted Mander-Jones to request information about Captain Thomas Beckford Simpson and Captain Edward Woodwin, general traders in the Southwest Pacific. This information appeared in Scheinberg's book, They Came for Sandalwood, a study of sandalwood trade in the Southwest Pacific, 1830 to 1865. A significant text which considers Indigenous motivations, not just imperial ambitions and intent. When she moved on to a new project in 1967, Scheinberg maintained correspondence with Mander-Jones and passed on record details from her research in the London Foreign Office. So as much as Mander-Jones was pushing information out to researchers, they were also feeding information back to her. And these relationships shaped the AJCP acquisitions, and this collaborative approach added a level of complexity of what it meant to say that they were collecting information for Australian researchers' interests in the 1960s. The AJCP administrative files also contained evidence of relationships between archivists and historians and librarians that were organised by the historian. Piecing together the process of German acquisitions as compared to the British microfilms has been difficult, as the Australian historian Marjorie Jacobs did not seem to be beholden to the same administrative requirements as Mander-Jones. We do know, though, that Jacobs worked under the umbrella of the AJCP to ensure Australian researchers could acquire records to create Pacific histories that were being demanded at that time. Jacobs joined the staff at Sydney University in 1938 as an associate lecturer, and there her research output focused on German New Guinea. During World War II, however, she found employment as a United States Army Historical Section researcher, and there she researched Southwest Pacific. The political climate of post-war Pacific ensured that she changed the direction of her research. She expanded her scope and developed histories concerning Asian and Pacific encounters with Europeans prior to World War II. And when she returned to Sydney University and was appointed full professor in 1967, she started working with the AJCP to acquire records from East Germany. So why were German records so important if Australia already had access to British imperial records? The acquisition of German archives and microfilm had great cultural and social value, enabling research into New Guinea and the Pacific before 1914. Germany was a significant force in the Pacific. It was a colonial power and it was a competitor of Britain. They annexed New Guinea, Samoa, parts of Micronesia. They controlled New Guinea, Samoa, and parts of Micronesia. They had a trading base in Samoa that was the heart of their colony in 1857. They also had trading bases in the Bismarck Archipelago, Marshall and Gilbert Islands in 1870s. And when they wanted to protect these interests, they annexed northeastern New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago in 1884. And the next year, they did the same with the Marshall Islands and Northern Solomon Islands. The German record surveyed and acquired off an alternative perspective to the colonisation of the Pacific Islands by the British, as detailed by the records captured by Mander-Jones. And the topics in these records include law, medicine, agriculture reports, statistics, expeditions, cartography, and now I'm thinking climate change information. Across all subjects, there is the potential to analyse Indigenous encounter experiences with outside forces and the social and cultural change that came with these. This collection of colonial German records, how it was acquired, is fascinating, as it demonstrated the AJCP networks based in London were used to acquire archival records outside of the British Empire also. So Jacobs travelled to East Germany, and these were funded by the Mitchell Library. Records from the NLA show that on the 18th of May 1967, Australia received communications that representatives of the East German archives were very anxious to obtain copies from the German Foreign Office, which had been captured by the British and the Americans at the end of World War II. These archives were going to be microfilmed before they were returned to Germany. So when Jacobs was in Germany, the post-war anxieties about archives expressed previously by Burmester, they were still very, very present. These records were going to be used, though, in an exchange with Potsdam, so the AJCP could acquire additional German records to create a more comprehensive collection that would be securely preserved in Australian cultural institutions. So there were a lot of transnational negotiations occurring at this time over German records that had been acquired after the war. Jacobs' role was comparative to that of an AJCP officer, but in her unofficial capacity. And this was really important because of the Iron Curtain at this time. Australian government services couldn't actually engage directly with German services. The unofficial aspect was also very important in 1969 when these negotiations fell over. It was then Jacobs who negotiated the exchange directly with German institutions to record and exchange records. She conducted archival surveys and she ordered the microfilms for delivery. So you can see on this slide that it states the films were to be marked as being a gift of no commercial value. This may be so, but another way of describing these records is as they were mod intended, with significant intellectual value. After Dr. Thorpe's presentation this morning, the limitations of this designation will be mused on by me, probably in the very early hours of tomorrow morning, but this is an important way of looking at it. The Journal of Pacific History in 1971 and 77 offered brief details about the successful acquisitions from Samoa, Dutch New Guinea, Micronesian Islands, Marshall Islands, and the Bismarck Archipelago. It's important to note that these reels actually, in the end, were not included in the AJCP collection, even though they were gathered underneath that umbrella. So keeping in mind research output and collaboration were integral to the AJCP's collaboration. It's interesting to see that there's areas in the collection where collaboration did not occur. So in my early stages with this research, between looking at collaborations between librarians, historians, and archivists, it seems that surrogate archives were an important aspect of creating new national visions in post-war Australasian region. And Pacific historians were especially involved with surveying, acquisition, and use of surrogate records as they examined the changing nature of the social and political forces in the Pacific Islands and Australia during colonisation. Regardless of whether an archivist, a librarian, or a historian was leading the survey, recording process, the AJCP collaborations were focused on access through acquisition. This intended outcome suggests that historians and archivists spent time creating innovative ways of gaining material, but the notion of access at this point in time did not include extending the collaboration to instances where metadata was adapted for Australian Pacific researchers looking for Indigenous encounters, a core aspect of this subdiscipline. So being that the AJCP was recently digitised, there is potential here to revisit it and reimagine what it is to collaborate now, in a period when the issue is not so much about access through acquisition, but with contemporary indexing or metadata changes. The work of Gillian Scott at the Pacific Manuscripts Bureau regarding Women's Guide for the collection in '92 indicates how improved access can come with indexing and community involvement. The work of rare book cataloguer Nina Whittaker, as seen on screen here, and she's now working at the SLV, in relation to Maori collections also demonstrates that interdisciplinary collaboration can be completed while respecting archival practices concerning provenance and arrangement. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Deborah. We've got time for some questions, a few quick questions. There's one here, thank you.
Thank you. Deborah, Guy Tranter from ABC. The collaboration with East German archives and not West German, was that because the East Germans had sort of inherited the central Berlin archives from the sort of German imperial government days?
Look, there was a lot of politics happening around at that time, and from what I can understand, the British actually stopped a lot of the direct negotiations with the AJCP in regards to those archives. There's not a lot of detail in the records that I was reading. It's just became like there's a line that says they fell over and that's it. So I wonder if there's a lot of unspoken things happening in there.
So in a sense, they were just doing the best they could, and if the East Germans were cooperative, then, you know, yeah.
Yeah, so Jim Davidson actually tried to get access to these records over a decade prior, and their inability to engage directly with the archivists and to get out of the country with these records saw those negotiations fall over. So I do wonder in some way if the AJCP was kind of prepared for that to happen again. But yes, I do get the sense that she was very proud she was able to do it when Davidson couldn't.
Thank you. Yeah.
Any other questions at the moment? Thank you for that fascinating insight into some geopolitical goings on. That was great. Thank you, Deborah.